The crimson sun dipped below the horizon as Jane Joseph stood at the weathered window of her small cabin, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. 3 months a widow, and the whispers in town had already begun whispers about Jacob Blackwell, the man who had murdered her husband and promised to return for her. The remote Montana territory of 1879 offered little protection for a woman alone, especially one carrying a child. A soft knock at her door startled Jane from her thoughts. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Thomas's rifle. Her husband may have been taken from her, but he had taught her well how to defend herself. "Who's there?" She called, her voice steadier than her hands. "Quentin O'Malley, madam. I've brought supplies from town." Jane hesitated, then lowered the rifle. Quentin was the new ranch hand at the neighboring property, a quiet man with kind eyes who had taken to checking on her these past few weeks. She unbolted the door and pulled it open. Quentin stood on her porch, hat in hand, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. His sandy hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and his weathered face creased with concern as he took in her pale complexion. "You all right, Mrs. Josephs?" he asked, setting down a crate of provisions. "I'm fine, Mr. O'Malley, just tired." She stepped back to allow him inside, grateful for the company despite her caution. "Please come in, I've just made coffee." As Jane moved to the stove, her foot caught on the uneven floorboard. She stumbled, and Quentin's strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her. For a moment they stood frozen, his touch warm through the thin fabric of her dress. "Careful now," he murmured, releasing her as if burned when he realized their proximity. Propriety still mattered, even at the edge of civilization. Jane busied herself with pouring coffee, hiding the flush that had risen to her cheeks. "Thank you for bringing these supplies. I would have gone to town myself, but—" She gestured vaguely to her belly. "No need to explain," Quentin said, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Sheriff Patterson asked me to stop by anyway. There's been talk." Jane's hand stilled. "What kind of talk?" "Jacob Blackwell was spotted in Billings last week." The cup slipped from Jane's fingers, shattering on the wooden floor, coffee spread like spilled blood between them. "He'll come for me," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "He promised the day he killed Thomas that he'd return." Quentin knelt to gather the broken pieces, his jaw set in a hard line. When he spoke, his voice was low and determined. "Then he'll find me waiting for him." Jane stared at him, this man she barely knew offering to risk his life for hers. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Quentin looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "I know enough, Mrs. Josephs. I know that no woman should face such threats alone, especially not in your condition. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger. You didn't ask." He stood, depositing the broken shards on the table. "I'm offering." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Jane wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the stove. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "Thomas was his partner in a claim. When they struck gold, Thomas wanted to use his share to build a life here for us, for our child. Jacob wanted to gamble it away. They fought, and Jacob—" Her voice broke. "You don't have to explain," Quentin said gently. "I do." Jane squared her shoulders. "Jacob believes Thomas hid the gold somewhere on this property. That's why he'll come back, not just for revenge, but for what he thinks is his." Quentin's expression hardened. "Is there gold?" "Thomas never told me. He said the less I knew, the safer I'd be." She laughed bitterly. How wrong he was. The cowboy was silent for a long moment, considering. Then he set his hat back on his head, decision made. "I'll be back in the morning with my things. I'll stay in the barn until this is settled." "Mr. O'Malley, Quentin," he corrected. "If I'm to be standing watch over you and your property, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Quentin," she repeated, his name unfamiliar on her tongue. "I can't repay you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'm not asking for payment, Mrs. Josephs." "Jane," she offered in return. He nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Lock this behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me or the sheriff until I return tomorrow." After he left, Jane bolted the door and leaned against it, listening to the sound of his horse retreating into the night. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, feeling the gentle movements of the child within. "We'll be all right," she whispered. uncertain if she was trying to convince the baby or herself. The night passed slowly, each creak and whisper of the wind sending Jane's heart racing. By dawn, she had dozed only fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. She was at the stove preparing breakfast when hoofbeats approached the cabin. Quentin arrived with the morning light, a pack of belongings slung over his shoulder and his rifle resting across his saddle. As promised, he settled into the small barn, arranging a makeshift bed in the hayloft that afforded a view of both the cabin and the road leading to the property. Days stretched into weeks, and a tentative rhythm developed between them. Quentin spent his days repairing fences, chopping wood, and tending to the few animals Jane kept. In the evenings, they would share simple meals, their conversations gradually deepening as Jane's initial wariness gave way to cautious trust. She learned that Quentin had been a soldier before turning to ranch work, that he had fought in the final year of the war between the states as little more than a boy, and that he had wandered westward ever since, never staying in one place for long. "What brought you to Montana?" Jane asked one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Quentin was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Running, I suppose," he finally said. "From memories." Jane nodded, understanding all too well. "And now you're trapped here because of my troubles." "Not trapped," he corrected. "Here by choice." As June blossomed into July, the heat grew oppressive. Jane's pregnancy advanced, her movements becoming more labored. Quentin took on more of the household duties without being asked, fetching water from the well and helping with tasks that had become difficult for Jane. One scorching afternoon, Jane found him shirtless by the creek that ran along the edge of her property, splashing water on his face and chest. She should have turned away, preserved his modesty and her own, but something held her in place. The sun glinted off the water droplets on his skin, highlighting the map of scars that told stories he had never shared. He sensed her presence and turned, reaching quickly for his shirt. "Forgive me, I didn't think." "No apology needed," Jane interrupted, her cheeks flushing. "It's your right to cool off on such a day." Quentin pulled his shirt back on, his movements efficient despite his obvious embarrassment. "Did you need something?" "Just walking," Jane said, her hand resting on her lower back where an ache had settled. "The midwife says movement is good for an easier birth." Concern crossed Quentin's features. "Should you be out here alone? The ground is uneven." Jane smiled, touched by his worry. "I'm with child, not made of glass." "Of course." A rare smile softened his face. "Still, may I walk with you? The exercise would do me good as well." They strolled alongside the creek, their pace unhurried. Jane found herself studying Quentin's profile when he wasn't looking, noting the strength in his jaw, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. She wondered what it would be like to trace those lines with her fingertips, then immediately chastised herself for such thoughts. Thomas had been dead barely 4 months. Her child would never know its father. What kind of woman was she, to find herself drawn to another man so soon? "You've gone quiet," Quentin observed. "Just thinking of Thomas," she admitted, guilt coloring her words. "Sometimes I fear I'm forgetting his face." Quentin's steps slowed. "Grief does that, blurs the edges. It doesn't mean you loved him any less." "Did you lose someone?" "In the war." "Many someones," he answered, his voice rough. "But one in particular, my brother Quinn. We were twins. He died at Petersburg 2 weeks before Lee surrendered." Jane's hand found his arm, offering comfort she wasn't sure he would accept. "I'm sorry." To her surprise, Quentin didn't pull away. "It was a lifetime ago, but I understand what it is to wonder if you're honoring someone's memory properly." The simple acknowledgement of her feelings, without judgment, loosened something tight in Jane's chest. They walked on in companionable silence until the baby gave a particularly forceful kick, causing Jane to gasp and press her hand to her side. Quentin was instantly alert. "What is it? Are you all right?" "Yes, just here." Without thinking, she took his hand and placed it on her belly where the baby was moving. "Feel." For a moment, Quentin remained perfectly still, his palm warm against the swell of her stomach. Then the baby kicked again, and wonder transformed his face. "That's something," he breathed. Their eyes met, and Jane became acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment, his hand on her body, her hand covering his, the shared marvel of new life moving beneath their touch. She should step away, maintain the proper distance between them, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. A distant gunshot shattered the moment. Quentin's hand moved from her belly to his holster in one fluid motion, his body instinctively positioning itself between Jane and the direction of the sound. "Probably just a hunter," Jane said, but her voice trembled. "Probably," Quentin agreed, though his posture remained tense. "Still, we should get back to the cabin." The peaceful afternoon was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the threat that still loomed over them. As they hurried back, Jane couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to rely on Quentin's strength. How easily she had come to trust him with her safety, and perhaps more dangerously, with her companionship. That night, a summer storm rolled across the valley, bringing with it sheets of rain and jagged bolts of lightning that illuminated the cabin in harsh flashes. Jane sat by the fire, attempting to mend a tear in one of Thomas's old shirts that she'd repurposed for her expanding waistline. Her fingers were clumsy with the needle, her mind distracted by the storm and by thoughts of Quentin in the barn. A particularly violent crack of thunder shook the cabin, and Jane dropped her sewing. Before she could retrieve it, a pounding at the door sent her heart racing. "Jane." "It's me, open up." Quentin's voice was barely audible over the storm, but the urgency in it had her moving quickly to the door. She pulled it open to find him soaked to the skin, water streaming from his hat and clothes. "The barn roof is leaking something fierce," he explained, stepping inside. "Half the hay is already soaked through." "You can't stay out there," Jane said, taking his dripping coat. "The floor in here is dry, at least." Quentin hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the impropriety of spending the night under the same roof as an unmarried woman, widow or not. "I could sleep on the porch." "Don't be foolish, you'll catch your death." Jane busied herself fetching a towel, avoiding his eyes. "The cabin is small, but there's room enough for you to sleep by the fire without compromising either of our reputations." Quentin accepted the towel with a nod of thanks, removing his hat and running the cloth over his hair. "I appreciate it." Jane turned away to give him privacy as he removed his wet shirt, her cheeks warm despite the chill in the air. She arranged a makeshift bed of blankets near the hearth while he changed into drier clothes. "There," she said when the bedding was arranged. "It's not much, but it's better than drowning in the barn. Thank you." Quentin stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, as if uncertain what to do with himself now that he was inside her home, truly inside her space. For the first time, Jane moved to her small table, pouring 2 cups of the herbal tea she'd been drinking to soothe her restless nights. "Here," she offered, holding out a cup. "To warm you." Their fingers brushed as he took it, and Jane felt that same spark of awareness that had flared by the creek. Judging by the way Quentin quickly withdrew his hand, he had felt it too. They sat in silence, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. The fire popped and hissed, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Jane found herself studying those shadows rather than looking at Quentin directly, afraid of what her eyes might reveal. "Your husband," Quentin said suddenly. "What was he like?" The question surprised her. Thomas was kind, steady. He had dreams bigger than this small plot of land. He wanted to build something lasting, something to pass down to our child. "He sounds like a good man." He was. Jane sipped her tea, memories washing over her. "We met in St. Louis. I was working as a seamstress, and he came in to have a shirt mended. He courted me for 6 months before proposing. My parents thought I was mad to follow him west, but I couldn't imagine any other life." Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating Quentin's thoughtful expression. "Do you regret it, coming west?" Jane considered the question, her hand drifting to her belly. "No, despite everything. No, this land may be harsh, but it's honest, and it was Thomas's dream, our dream. And now I have to make a new dream," she answered softly. "For my child's sake, if not my own." Quentin nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're stronger than you know, Jane Josephs." The use of her full name, spoken with such quiet conviction, brought unexpected tears to Jane's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to give in to the emotions the storm and his presence had stirred. "I should let you rest," she said, rising from her chair with some difficulty due to her advancing pregnancy. Quentin was immediately on his feet, a steadying hand at her elbow. "Are you all right?" "Just tired. The baby is restless tonight," she managed a smile. "Perhaps it doesn't care for storms either." "May I?" Quentin asked, his hand hovering near her belly. Jane nodded, unable to form words as he gently placed his palm against her. The baby, as if responding to his touch, gave a solid kick. Quentin's laugh was soft and wondering. "Strong little one." "Like its father," Jane said automatically, then froze as she realized how the words might sound, as if she were comparing Thomas to Quentin, as if she were already thinking of Quentin in terms that she had no right to consider. But if Quentin noticed her discomfort, he gave no sign. He simply withdrew his hand and stepped back, restoring the proper distance between them. "Good night, Jane. Sleep well." "Good night, Quentin." In her small bed behind the privacy screen, Jane lay awake long after she should have been asleep, listening to Quentin's steady breathing from the other side of the room. The storm gradually subsided, leaving only the occasional distant rumble of thunder and the soft patter of rain. In those quiet hours, Jane allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been fighting for weeks, that her feelings for Quentin O'Malley had grown into something far more complicated than gratitude. It terrified her, this unwanted attraction. It felt like a betrayal of Thomas, of the life they had planned, of the child that would carry his name. And yet, when she finally drifted into sleep, it was Quentin's face she saw, not her husband's. The dawn broke clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Jane woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the main room of the cabin. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she imagined it was Thomas preparing breakfast as he so often had. Reality returned with crushing weight. She rose, dressed, and steeled herself to face Quentin after the strange intimacy of the night before. He was at the stove, his back to her as he tended to a pot of what smelled like oatmeal. He had already been outside, his boots were damp, and fresh kindling had been added to the woodpile near the hearth. "You didn't have to cook," Jane said by way of greeting. Quentin turned, offering a tentative smile. "Seemed the least I could do after you gave me shelter. How did you sleep?" "Well enough." The lie came easily. "And you?" "Fine." He poured her a cup of coffee, doctoring it with the small amount of cream they had left, a luxury he usually declined for himself. "The barn roof will need proper repairs, but it's not as bad as I feared in the dark." They fell into a discussion of practical matters the repairs needed, supplies that were running low, whether the garden would yield enough to see them through the coming months. It was safer territory than the undercurrents that had swirled between them during the storm. After breakfast, Quentin returned to the barn to salvage what he could of the soaked hay. Jane busied herself with household tasks, trying not to watch him through the window as he worked, his movements efficient and purposeful. By midday, the July sun had turned the world steamy, evaporating the puddles from the previous night's rain. Jane was hanging laundry on the line stretched between two pine trees when she heard the approach of horses, more than one, coming fast. Quentin appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, his expression grim. "Get inside," he ordered, all the gentleness gone from his voice. Now, Jane hurried to obey, one hand protectively cradling her belly as she moved as quickly as her condition would allow. From inside the cabin, she peered through the window, heart pounding as 3 riders came into view. Relief flooded her when she recognized Sheriff Patterson's tall figure among them. She unbolted the door and stepped onto the porch just as the riders pulled up. "Mrs. Joseph's," the sheriff greeted, tipping his hat. "O'Malley." "Sheriff," Quentin acknowledged, lowering his rifle but not setting it aside. "What brings you out this way?" Patterson dismounted, his weathered face grave. "News you need to hear. Jacob Blackwell was spotted in Silver Creek yesterday." Jane's knees weakened, and she gripped the porch railing for support. Silver Creek was less than a day's ride away. "You're certain?" Quentin asked, moving to stand beside Jane, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from him. "Certain," confirmed one of the other riders, a man Jane recognized as Bill Taylor, who ran the saloon in town. "He was in my establishment asking questions about the Joseph's place. Didn't realize who he was until after he'd gone." "He wasn't alone either," added the third rider, Deputy Young. Had 2 men with him, rough-looking sorts. "I've deputized these men to help keep watch," Sheriff Patterson explained. "We'll set up a rotation. No one's getting to you without going through us first, Mrs. Josephs." Jane found her voice at last. "Thank you, Sheriff. But I can't ask you all to risk yourselves." "Not asking," Patterson said firmly. "This is what community does. Besides, Blackwell isn't just wanted for your husband's murder anymore. He shot a man in Billings last month. The territories put a price on his head." Quentin's jaw tightened. "So he's desperate and dangerous," the sheriff agreed. "Which is why we're not taking any chances. Bill will take the first watch with me. Deputy Young will ride back to town and organize more men." As the men discussed the logistics of their protective arrangement, Jane retreated into the cabin, her hands shaking as she poured herself a glass of water. The threat that had seemed abstract for so long was suddenly immediate and concrete. Jacob Blackwell was coming just as he had promised, and he was bringing men with him. The door opened and Quentin stepped inside. "Jane, I'm fine," she said automatically, though they both knew it was a lie. Quentin crossed to her, taking the glass from her trembling hands and setting it aside. Then, to her surprise, he took both her hands in his. "Listen to me. Nothing is going to happen to you or your baby. I won't let it." "You can't promise that," Jane whispered. "Thomas promised to keep us safe too." Pain flickered across Quentin's face. "I know I'm not Thomas, but I give you my word, as long as there's breath in my body, I'll protect you." The fierceness in his voice, the unwavering determination in his eyes broke through Jane's fear. She squeezed his hands. "I believe you." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, fragile yet undeniable. They stood, hands clasped, eyes locked, until a knock at the door reminded them they were not alone. The next 3 days passed in a state of heightened vigilance. True to his word, Sheriff Patterson organized a rotation of men from town to keep watch over the property. Quentin remained closest to the cabin, his rifle never far from reach, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Jane tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, tending to her garden, preparing meals, and continuing the endless tasks of keeping a household running. But the strain took its toll. Her back ached constantly, and the baby seemed more active than ever, as if sensing its mother's anxiety. On the 4th night, Jane woke to a sharp pain that took her breath away. She lay in the darkness, counting seconds until it subsided, then exhaled shakily. False labor, surely. The midwife had warned her that her body might practice for the real thing in the final weeks. She had just begun to drift back to sleep when another pain gripped her, stronger than before. This time she couldn't suppress a gasp. Footsteps approached her screened-off sleeping area. "Jane," Quentin's voice was pitched low, concerned. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she managed. "Just..." "The baby is restless." Another pain answered her, and this time she couldn't hold back a moan. There was a moment of hesitation from beyond the screen, then Quentin spoke again, more urgently. "Jane, I'm coming in." The privacy screen was pushed aside and Quentin appeared, a lamp in his hand. The concern on his face deepened as he took in her pallor and the way she clutched at her belly. "The baby," she admitted, fear making her voice thin. "It's too early." Quentin set the lamp down and knelt beside her bed. "How far along are you?" 8 months, perhaps a little less." Another contraction seized her and she reached blindly for his hand. He gave it without hesitation, letting her grip it until the pain passed. "The midwife is in town, Mrs. Henderson." "I'll send one of the men for her," Quentin said decisively. He helped Jane into a sitting position, arranging pillows behind her back. "Can you walk? You'll be more comfortable in the main room where we can keep the fire going." With Quentin's support, Jane made her way to the chair by the hearth. He stoked the fire, then went to speak with Bill Taylor, who was on watch outside. Within minutes, Bill had ridden off toward town to fetch the midwife. Left alone with Jane, Quentin seemed at a loss. "What can I do?" "Water," Jane said, trying to focus through the building pressure in her lower back. "And talk to me, distract me." Quentin brought her water, then pulled up a chair beside her. "What shall I talk about? Anything. Tell me something about yourself I don't know." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I used to want to be a doctor before the war. My father was a country doctor in Pennsylvania. Quinn and I would help him sometimes, carrying his bag, preparing supplies." Why didn't you?" Jane asked, grateful for the conversation even as another contraction began to build. The war changed things. After Quinn died, I couldn't. I didn't want to be around more death. He noticed her tensing and offered his hand again. "Breathe through it, that's it." Jane squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. As the contraction eased, she realized something. "You'd make a good doctor. You have gentle hands." Color touched Quentin's cheeks, visible even in the firelight. High praise from a woman in labor. The next hour passed slowly, the contractions coming at irregular intervals. Quentin kept Jane talking when she could, fetched water when she was thirsty, and supported her when she needed to walk around the room to ease the pressure in her back. His presence was oddly comforting, despite the impropriety of a man attending a woman in such a condition. "The midwife should be here soon," Quentin reassured her as a particularly strong contraction left Jane gasping. "And if she's not?" Jane asked, fear edging her voice. Quentin's expression was resolute. "Then we'll manage. I've helped birth calves and foals. The principle can't be so different." Despite her pain, Jane laughed. "I'm not a mare, Quentin O'Malley." His smile was warm. "No, you're far braver." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment of levity. Quentin moved to the window, peering out into the pre-dawn darkness. His posture changed instantly, tension returning to every line of his body. "Stay here," he ordered, reaching for his rifle. "What is it?" Jane struggled to rise from the chair, alarm cutting through the pain. "3 riders, not the sheriff or the midwife." Quentin's voice was grim. "It's Blackwell. I recognize him from the wanted poster." Fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over Jane. "No, not now, not when the baby is coming." Quentin crossed to her quickly, crouching to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. Deputy Young is still out there, keeping watch from the ridge. He'll have seen them coming. Help will be here soon. I need you to stay inside, away from the windows. Can you do that?" Jane nodded, another contraction stealing her breath before she could speak. Quentin hesitated, clearly torn between staying with her and confronting the threat outside. "I'll be right back," he promised. "Lock the door behind me." As soon as he slipped out, Jane forced herself to her feet and bolted the door as instructed. Through the window, she could see Quentin standing on the porch, rifle raised, as 3 mounted figures approached the cabin. "That's far enough," Quentin's voice carried through the early morning air. "This property is under the protection of the sheriff's office. Turn around and ride out." One of the riders, a man with a dark beard and a weathered face, laughed. "Big talk for a hired gun. Where's the widow? I've got business with her." "Any business you have can be conducted through me, Blackwell," Quentin replied, his voice steady despite the danger. Jane moved closer to the window. One hand pressed to her lower back as another contraction began to build. She could see Jacob Blackwell, clearly now older than she remembered, with new lines etched into his face by hard living and harder choices. The sight of him, the man who had murdered Thomas in cold blood, sent a surge of hatred through her that was almost as powerful as the pain of labor. "The lady and I have unfinished business," Blackwell drawled. "Her husband took something that belongs to me and I aim to get it back." "There's nothing here for you," Quentin said, his rifle unwavering. "Just a widow trying to live in peace." Blackwell's laugh was ugly. "Peace? There won't be any peace until I get what's mine. Thomas Joseph stole my gold, and his pretty wife knows where it is." "The only thing Thomas Joseph's ever stole was my husband's life," Jane called from the window, unable to remain silent any longer. "There is no gold, Jacob. There never was." Blackwell's head snapped toward her voice. "There you are, Jane, still as lovely as ever, I see." His gaze dropped to her belly, visible even through the window, and carrying Thomas's brat. How touching. "Ride away, Jacob," Jane said, her voice stronger than she felt as another contraction gripped her. "The sheriff knows you're in the area. There are men watching this property." "I don't see anyone but this cowboy," Blackwell sneered, gesturing to Quentin, "and he's outnumbered." As if to punctuate his words, his 2 companions spread out, flanking the cabin. One of them raised a rifle, aiming it directly at Quentin. Time seemed to slow. Jane saw Quentin's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Blackwell's hand move to his holster, saw the second man take aim. She opened her mouth to scream a warning, but before she could, a shot rang out from the ridge to the east. The man aiming at Quentin jerked, then toppled from his horse. In the confusion that followed, Quentin fired, his bullet catching Blackwell's horse. The animal reared, throwing its rider to the ground. "Get down," Quentin shouted to Jane, but she was already dropping to the floor, her body curling protectively around her belly as more shots were exchanged. Through the wooden slats of the cabin wall, Jane could hear shouting, the thunder of more hoofbeats approaching, and the continued crack of gunfire. The baby chose that moment to send another wave of pain through her body, more intense than any before. Jane bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she rode through the contraction. Suddenly, the door rattled as someone tried the handle. "Jane, it's me, let me in." Quentin's voice sent relief flooding through her. She crawled to the door, every movement agony, and managed to slide the bolt open. Quentin burst in, his face streaked with dirt and what looked like blood at his temple. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, helping her away from the door. "No, but the baby," Jane broke off as another contraction seized her, this one bringing with it an unmistakable urge to push. "The sheriff and his men are here," Quentin explained quickly, leading her toward the bed. They were right behind Blackwell, the fight's nearly over. And Blackwell. Jane gasped as the contraction eased, wounded but alive. "They're taking him and his remaining man into custody." Quentin helped her onto the bed, then wet a cloth to wipe her face. The midwife was on her way with them. She should be here any minute. As if summoned by his words, the door opened again, and Mrs. Henderson bustled in, her capable presence immediately filling the small cabin. "Well now, what have we here? A baby deciding to arrive in the middle of a gunfight. That's a story for the grandchildren." The midwife took charge with practiced efficiency, shooing Quentin outside despite his reluctance to leave Jane's side. "This is women's business now, Mr. O'Malley. You've done your part keeping her safe. Let me do mine bringing this child into the world." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort for Jane. Mrs. Henderson's calm instructions guided her through the labor, helping her find strength she didn't know she possessed. Outside, she could hear men's voices as the sheriff and his deputies secured the prisoners and tended to the wounded. Just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, filling the cabin with golden light, Jane's child entered the world with a lusty cry that testified to healthy lungs despite its early arrival. "A boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket. "Small but strong. Just like his mama." Tears of exhaustion and joy streamed down Jane's face as she held her son for the first time. His tiny face was red and wrinkled, his fists clenched as if ready to fight the world. Thomas's son, their dream made flesh. "Would you like me to call Mr. O'Malley in?" The midwife asked as she tidied up. "He's been pacing a trench in your yard these past hours." Jane hesitated, then nodded. There was something right about Quentin being among the first to meet her son, though she couldn't have explained why. When Quentin entered, his eyes went immediately to the bundle in Jane's arms. He approached slowly, almost reverently, his expression a mix of wonder and something deeper, more complex. "Jane," he breathed, sinking into the chair beside her bed. "He's beautiful. Would you like to hold him?" The offer surprised Jane as much as it seemed to surprise Quentin. With careful hands, he accepted the newborn, cradling him with unexpected confidence. "Hello, little man," he whispered. "You've had quite an exciting entrance to the world." Watching Quentin with her son stirred emotions in Jane that she wasn't prepared to examine not yet, not when her body was still recovering from birth, and her mind was still processing the events of the night. "Blackwell?" she asked instead. "Took a bullet in the shoulder," Quentin reported, his eyes still on the baby. "The sheriff has him securely locked up in one of the wagons they brought. They'll take him to Helena for trial as soon as it's safe to move him. His other man didn't make it. And you, that's blood on your temple." Quentin touched the dried blood absently. "Just a graze, nothing to worry about." Mrs. Henderson interrupted them, bringing a cup of willow bark tea for Jane's pain. "The baby will need a name," she commented as she helped Jane sit up to drink. Jane looked at her son, now sleeping peacefully in Quentin's arms. "Thomas for his father," she decided. Then, after a moment's consideration, "Thomas Quinn Josephs." Quentin's head jerked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Quinn." "If you don't mind," Jane said softly, "it seems fitting." The emotion that crossed Quentin's face was too complex to name: gratitude, pain, honor, and something that might have been love, all tangled together. "I don't mind," he managed finally. "Thank you." In the days that followed, as Jane recovered her strength and learned the rhythms of motherhood, the story of the shootout at the Josephs' homestead spread throughout the territory. Sheriff Patterson made a point of stopping by to inform them that Jacob Blackwell had been formally charged not only with Thomas's murder, but with the killing in Billings and the attack on Jane's property. He would hang for his crimes, and the threat he posed was finally, truly over. Quentin remained at the homestead, though he moved back to the now repaired barn as propriety demanded. His presence became a comfort Jane didn't want to question, a constant in her new life as a mother. He was there to chop wood when she needed it, to help with the heavier household tasks, to hold little Thomas when Jane needed a moment's rest. As summer gave way to autumn, bringing with it the first hint of coolness in the mountain air, Jane found herself watching Quentin more and more. The way his hands, so large and capable, could be infinitely gentle with her son. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, a sight that was becoming more frequent. The way he seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Thomas slept inside, Jane finally gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Why have you stayed, Quentin? Blackwell is gone. The threat is over. You could have returned to your own life months ago." Quentin was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, as if each word had been carefully chosen. "At first, I stayed because I gave my word to protect you. Then I stayed because you needed help with the baby and the homestead." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Now I stay because I can't imagine being anywhere else." The simple honesty of his answer took Jane's breath away. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything," Quentin assured her. "I don't expect anything from you, Jane. I know your heart still belongs to Thomas, and rightly so. He was your husband, the father of your child." "Yes," Jane agreed softly. "I will always love Thomas, but—" She hesitated, searching for words to express the complicated tangle of emotions she had been avoiding for months. "My heart isn't as simple as that. It's possible to honor what was while still embracing what might be." Hope flickered across Quentin's face, quickly tempered by caution. "What are you saying?" Jane took a deep breath. "I'm saying that when I look at you with my son, when I see the care you take with both of us, I feel something I never expected to feel again, and it frightens me because it seems too soon, too complicated, but it's there all the same." Quentin reached across the space between their chairs, his hand finding hers. "There's no proper timeline for healing, Jane, no rule that says how long grief should last or when you're allowed to feel joy again." "Is that what this is? Joy?" His smile was gentle, among other things. From inside the cabin, Thomas began to cry, his hungry wails cutting through the evening stillness. Jane rose, her hand slipping from Quentin's, but she paused at the door. "Stay," she said softly. "Not just tonight, but stay if you want to." The look Quentin gave her was answer enough, but he put it into words anyway. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." As the weeks passed, their tentative understanding deepened into something stronger. Quentin continued to sleep in the barn, mindful of Jane's reputation in the small community, but his days were spent at the cabin, becoming an increasingly important part of Jane and Thomas's lives. The first snow of winter arrived early that year, blanketing the valley in white silence. Jane woke to find Quentin already at work, clearing a path from the cabin to the barn and well, his breath fogging in the cold air. Thomas, now nearly 4 months old and growing stronger each day, watched from his cradle as Jane prepared breakfast. When Quentin stamped the snow from his boots and entered the cabin, the baby gave a delighted gurgle, his tiny arms waving in greeting. "Someone's happy to see you," Jane observed, smiling as Quentin crossed to the cradle and lifted Thomas into his arms. "The feeling's mutual, little man," Quentin replied, his face softening as it always did when he held the baby. "You're getting heavier by the day." Jane set a plate of food on the table. "Sit and eat before it gets cold. You've been working since dawn." Quentin settled into a chair, still cradling Thomas with one arm while he ate with his free hand. It was a familiar scene, one that had become part of their daily rhythm. Yet Jane found herself pausing to watch, struck by how right it felt this man and her son, together in her kitchen, filling the space with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. "I need to ride into town today," Quentin said between bites. "We're running low on coffee and I want to check if there's any mail." Jane nodded, sitting down across from him. "Could you see if Mrs. Henderson has any of that salve for Thomas's rash? It seems to be the only thing that helps." "Of course." Quentin hesitated, then added, "I thought I might stop by the church as well, speak with Reverend Davis." Something in his tone made Jane look up sharply. "Oh," Quentin met her gaze steadily, though she could see uncertainty in his eyes. "I wanted to ask him. That is, if you would consider." He took a breath, seemed to gather his courage. "Jane, I love you. I love Thomas as if he were my own. I know it hasn't been very long, and I'll understand if you need more time, but I wanted to ask if you would consider becoming my wife." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with hope and possibility. Jane's heart seemed to stutter, then race ahead. She had known, somewhere deep inside, that they were moving toward this moment, yet hearing the words aloud still took her breath away. "I'm not trying to replace Thomas," Quentin added quickly. "I know I never could, but I want to build a life with you, to help raise his son, to face whatever comes next together." Jane rose from her chair and moved around the table until she stood beside him. With gentle fingers, she lifted Thomas from Quentin's arms and placed the baby back in his cradle. Then, surprising herself as much as Quentin, she sat in his lap, her arms going around his neck. "Yes," she said simply, her voice clear and certain despite the tears that threatened. "Yes, I will marry you, Quentin O'Malley." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, Jane leaned forward and pressed her lips to his their first kiss, sweet and tentative at first, then deepening as months of unspoken longing found release. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Jane rested her forehead against his. "I'm sure," she whispered. "I think part of me has been sure since that day by the creek when you felt Thomas kick for the first time. I was just afraid to admit it, even to myself." Quentin's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I fell in love with you that first night when you stood in your doorway with a rifle and still offered me coffee. I tried not to, knowing your circumstances, but some things can't be helped." "No," Jane agreed softly. "Some things are simply meant to be." They were married the following Sunday in the small church in town, with Thomas cradled in Mrs. Henderson's arms and Sheriff Patterson standing as witness. The ceremony was simple, the congregation small but supportive. Many of the townsfolk had come to respect Quentin for his protection of Jane during the Blackwell affair, and Jane herself had earned their admiration for her courage in the face of such threats. Reverend Davis spoke of new beginnings and of love that grows from unexpected soil, words that resonated deeply with both bride and groom. When it came time to speak their vows, Quentin's voice was strong and sure, his eyes never leaving Jane's face. Jane's own voice trembled slightly, but her words were no less certain as she promised to build a life with this man who had come to her aid when she needed it most. As they rode back to the homestead, their homestead now, truly snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down from a pearl-gray sky. Quentin drew his horse alongside Jane's, reaching across to take her gloved hand in his. "Happy?" he asked, his breath visible in the cold air. Jane looked at him, at the man who had promised to wait for danger and had stayed for love, and felt a peace she had thought lost forever. "Yes," she answered truthfully, "more than I ever thought possible again." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of the cabin, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, Jane traced the contours of Quentin's face with gentle fingers. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "What are you thinking?" he murmured. "That life takes strange turns," she replied. "A year ago I was a widow, afraid and alone, certain that my story had reached its darkest chapter. Now I'm here with you and Thomas, beginning something new." Quentin drew her closer, his arms strong and secure around her. Not just something new, he corrected. Something lasting. Jane rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Something lasting, she agreed, for all of us. Spring came early to the Montana territory that year, bringing with it renewal and growth that seemed to mirror the life taking root at the Joseph's O'Malley homestead. Quentin had expanded the barn, adding a proper stable for the horses he was breeding, the beginning of the ranch he and Jane had discussed during the long winter nights. Thomas, now 10 months old, was crawling everywhere, his curious nature keeping both his mother and adoptive father constantly alert. He had Quentin wrapped around his tiny finger, a fact that Jane observed with loving amusement. One warm afternoon, as Jane hung laundry while Thomas played in a patch of grass nearby, she spotted Quentin returning from checking the fence line. He dismounted, secured his horse, and made his way toward them, stopping to scoop Thomas up when the baby crawled eagerly in his direction. "How are my two favorite people?" Quentin asked, settling Thomas on his hip and leaning down to kiss Jane's cheek. "Busy," Jane replied, smiling as Thomas grabbed at Quentin's beard with curious fingers. "Your son decided that the flower bin was a fascinating place to explore this morning." Quentin's expression softened at the words "your son," as it always did. He had formally adopted Thomas after their wedding, though they both ensured the boy would know about his birth father as he grew. "Is that right, little man?" Quentin bounced Thomas gently, earning a delighted giggle. "Were you helping your mama bake? If by helping you mean creating the biggest mess this kitchen has seen since last Christmas, then yes, he was extremely helpful," Jane teased, hanging the last of the sheets on the line. Quentin laughed, the sound carrying across the yard. It was a sound Jane never tired of hearing, a reminder of the joy they had found together, despite all odds. "I have news," Quentin said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I ran into Jim Cooper on the North Ridge. He was riding back from Helena." Jane stilled, instantly alert. Jim Cooper was the deputy who had replaced Young after the latter had moved east the previous autumn. "What did he say?" "Blackwell's hanging is set for next week. The governor finally signed the order." Jane nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Jacob Blackwell's trial had concluded months ago, but legal delays had postponed the execution repeatedly. Part of her had feared he would somehow escape justice, as he had so many times before. "Are you all right?" Quentin asked, his free arms slipping around her waist. "Yes," Jane said, and was surprised to realize it was true. "It doesn't bring Thomas back, but it closes something, a chapter that needed ending. We don't have to discuss it anymore if you don't want to." Jane leaned into his embrace, grateful for his understanding. "Actually, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, something I've been waiting for the right moment to share." Quentin looked down at her, curiosity in his eyes. "That sounds serious." "It is." Jane took a deep breath, then smiled up at him. "Thomas is going to be a big brother come winter." For a moment, Quentin simply stared at her, processing her words. Then his face transformed with such pure joy that Jane felt tears prick at her eyes. "Jane," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you certain, Mrs. Henderson confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to be sure before I told you." She laughed as he suddenly pulled her closer, careful not to crush Thomas between them. "I take it you're happy about this." "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Quentin declared, his eyes suspiciously bright. He set Thomas down in his grassy play area, then turned back to Jane, taking both her hands in his. "A baby, our baby, our baby," Jane agreed, placing one of his hands on her still flat stomach. "A new life to add to the one we're building." Quentin knelt suddenly, pressing a gentle kiss to her middle. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "We're already looking forward to meeting you." The simple, heartfelt gesture brought fresh tears to Jane's eyes. This was a man who had never expected to have a family of his own, who had wandered for years after losing his twin, who had come to her homestead simply to offer protection and had found a home instead. "I love you," she said, running her fingers through his hair. "Both of you." "All of you," she amended, smiling down at Thomas, who was happily pulling up grass tufts. Quentin rose to his feet, gathering her in his arms once more. "And I love you, Jane O'Malley, more than I ever thought possible." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long golden shadows across the land that was now truly their home. Jane looked from her husband to her son, and thought of the child growing within her. From the ashes of tragedy, they had built something beautiful, a family bound not just by blood, but by choice, by love that had bloomed in the most unexpected circumstances. The pregnant widow who had once whispered, "He'll come for me," in fear, now stood in the arms of the cowboy who had promised, "Then he'll find me waiting for him." The threat was gone, the danger past, but the promise remained a vow of protection that had transformed into a lifetime commitment. "What are you thinking?" Quentin asked, echoing the question he so often posed in their quiet moments together. Jane smiled, her heart full to bursting with contentment. That sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, and that this one, our story, is still being written. "With many chapters yet to come," Quentin agreed, his arms tightening around her as Thomas crawled over to tug at their legs, demanding to be included in their embrace. As the little family stood together in the fading light, the shadows of the past receded further, making way for the promise of tomorrow, a promise as vast and hopeful as the Montana sky stretching endlessly above them.